The morning
The
sun
breach is
cast long
widening.
shadows
We have to
across the
move
naval
now.
base as
Understood.
Elena
Prepare
Martinez
for
walked
immediate
through the
action.
corridors of the medical wing. Her white coat fluttered behind her as she moved with purpose, clipboard in hand, checking on patients who had been injured during the recent training exercises. As the head medical officer at the Pacific Naval Command, she had seen her share of injuries, but nothing had prepared her for what was about to unfold. Elena had always been strong. Growing up in a small coastal town, she learned early that life doesn't give you breaks just because you're young or innocent. Her father worked double shifts at the docks while her mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. Money was always tight, but love was abundant in their small home. Elena's dream of becoming a doctor seemed impossible until a scholarship opened the door to medical school. Years of hard work led her to specialize in military medicine. She believed in serving those who served their country. The naval base became her second home, and the sailors and officers became her extended family. She treated everything from minor cuts to serious combat injuries, always with the same gentle care and professional dedication. Admiral James Harrison had been watching Elena from a distance for months. Not in a romantic way, though he couldn't deny she was beautiful. What impressed him was her skill, her dedication, and the way she treated every person who came through her medical bay with genuine concern. He was a man of few words, having spent 30 years climbing the ranks of the Navy. His reputation for being tough but fair had earned him respect throughout the fleet. The Admiral had his own struggles. A divorce 5 years earlier had left him questioning whether he was capable of maintaining relationships outside of his military duties. His ex-wife often complained that he loved the Navy more than his family. Perhaps she was right. The structure and order of military life made sense to him in ways that civilian relationships never seemed to. On this particular Tuesday morning, Elena was making her rounds when she noticed something concerning. Several crew members had reported feeling ill after the previous day's training exercise. The symptoms were similar: nausea, dizziness, and fatigue. She decided to investigate further, suspecting possible contamination in the water supply or food services. As she gathered medical files and prepared to brief her concerns to the command staff, Elena felt a sharp pain in her side. She had been experiencing discomfort for weeks but attributed it to long work hours and stress. The pain was getting worse, but she pushed through it. There were patients to care for, and she couldn't let her personal discomfort interfere with her duties. The briefing room was filled with senior officers when Elena presented her findings about the crew members' illnesses. Admiral Harrison sat at the head of the table, his steel-gray eyes focused intently on her presentation. She explained the symptoms, the timeline, and her preliminary investigation results. Her voice was steady and professional, despite the increasing pain in her ribs. "Dr. Martinez," the Admiral said after she finished, "what's your recommendation for next steps?" Elena outlined a comprehensive plan for testing water sources, inspecting food preparation areas, and monitoring all affected personnel. As she spoke, she unconsciously pressed her hand against her side where the pain was becoming unbearable. She tried to hide her discomfort, but small beads of sweat had formed on her forehead. After the briefing, most officers filed out, but Admiral Harrison remained. He had noticed Elena's subtle signs of distress during the presentation. Years of reading people in high-stress situations had taught him to pick up on details others might miss. "Doctor, are you feeling all right?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine concern rather than official inquiry. Elena straightened up, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, Admiral. Just tired from the long investigation." But Harrison wasn't convinced. He had seen enough injured personnel to recognize when someone was pushing through pain. "When was the last time you had a medical examination yourself?" The question caught Elena off guard. She realized she couldn't remember the last time she had seen another doctor for her own health. Like many medical professionals, she was better at caring for others than herself. "I don't really have time for that, sir. My patients need me." "That wasn't what I asked," Harrison replied firmly. "Doctor, you can't take care of others if you don't take care of yourself first." Elena appreciated his concern, but she had work to do. The crew members were counting on her to find the source of their illness. She excused herself and returned to the medical wing, where she spent the next several hours coordinating tests and examinations. As the day wore on, the pain in Elena's side became more intense. She tried to focus on her patients, but found herself having to sit down frequently. Her usual energy and enthusiasm were flagging, and she struggled to maintain her professional demeanor. Dr. Sarah Chen, Elena's assistant and close friend, noticed the change in her behavior. Sarah had worked alongside Elena for 2 years and knew her better than most people on the base. Elena was typically energetic and hands-on with patient care, but today she seemed withdrawn and pale. "Elena, you look terrible," Sarah said bluntly during a brief moment between patients. "What's going on?" Elena waved off her concern. "I'm just tired. This investigation is taking more out of me than I expected." But Sarah wasn't buying it. She had seen Elena work through exhaustion before, and this was different. There was something physical happening that Elena was trying to hide. "When did you last eat? Or sleep properly?" Elena couldn't answer honestly because she couldn't remember. The pain had been affecting her appetite and sleep for weeks. She had been surviving on coffee and adrenaline, telling herself she would rest once this current crisis was resolved. The afternoon brought new developments in the investigation. Test results showed contamination in one of the water filtration systems, confirming Elena's suspicions. She felt relieved that they had identified the source quickly, but her own physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. As she prepared the report on the contamination findings, Elena suddenly felt dizzy. The room began to spin slightly, and she gripped the edge of her desk to steady herself. The pain in her ribs had become a constant, burning sensation that made it difficult to take deep breaths. Admiral Harrison appeared in the medical wing doorway just as Elena was struggling to maintain her composure. He had come to check on the investigation progress, but immediately noticed that something was seriously wrong. Elena's face was pale, and her breathing seemed labored. "Dr. Martinez," he said, stepping closer, "I think you need to sit down." Elena shook her head, though the movement made her dizziness worse. "I need to finish this report. The crew needs to know about the water contamination so we can prevent more cases." Harrison's expression shifted from concern to determination. "Doctor, that's an order. Sit down and let someone examine you." The authority in his voice was unmistakable, but Elena was too focused on her patients to fully register it. She tried to take a step toward her computer but stumbled slightly. Harrison moved quickly to steady her, his strong hands gently guiding her to a chair. "Sarah," he called to Dr. Chen, who rushed over immediately. "I think Dr. Martinez needs medical attention." Elena protested weakly, but the fight was going out of her. The pain had become overwhelming, and she could no longer pretend everything was normal. Sarah quickly began checking her vital signs while Admiral Harrison stood nearby, his usually stern expression replaced by genuine worry. "Elena, your pulse is elevated and your breathing is shallow," Sarah said, her voice taking on the clinical tone she used with patients. "I need to examine you properly." Elena finally nodded, too exhausted to continue resisting. The weight of weeks of ignored symptoms was catching up with her, and she realized she might have made a serious mistake by putting off her own medical care. Admiral Harrison watched as Sarah began her examination, noting the careful way Elena moved and the way she instinctively protected her left side. He had seen enough combat injuries to recognize when someone was in significant pain, and he was beginning to understand that Elena had been suffering in silence for far too long. As Sarah gently palpated Elena's abdomen and ribs, Elena couldn't suppress a sharp intake of breath. The pain was getting worse, and she was beginning to worry that this might be more serious than simple stress or overwork. "Elena," Sarah said softly, "I need you to lift your shirt so I can see what's happening with your ribs." Elena hesitated. She had been avoiding looking at the area herself, afraid of what she might find. But, with Admiral Harrison and Sarah both looking at her with such concern, she knew she couldn't delay any longer. The room fell silent as Elena slowly began to unbutton her blouse, preparing to reveal what she had been hiding from everyone, including herself, for far too long. Elena's hands trembled as she slowly lifted her medical coat and blouse. The fabric stuck slightly to her skin, and she winced as she peeled it away. What was revealed underneath made both Sarah and Admiral Harrison freeze in shock. Dark purple bruises covered Elena's left side, spreading from her lower ribs up toward her shoulder blade. But, worse than the bruising were the angry red marks that looked like deep scratches or gouges along her ribcage. Some appeared to be healing, while others looked fresh and inflamed. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone with military medical training. "My God, Elena," Sarah whispered, her professional composure cracking. "How long have you been hiding this?" Admiral Harrison said nothing, but his jaw tightened as he processed what he was seeing. His mind immediately went to the worst possible scenarios. These weren't injuries from a simple fall or accident. The pattern and severity suggested something much more serious. Elena couldn't meet their eyes. The shame and embarrassment she had been carrying for weeks suddenly felt overwhelming. She had told herself she could handle this alone, that it would heal on its own, that no one needed to know. But seeing the shock on their faces made her realize how serious her situation had become. "It's not what you think," Elena said quietly, though her voice lacked conviction. She wasn't even sure what they were thinking, but she could see the questions forming in their minds. Sarah carefully examined the wounds without touching them directly. Her training told her these were defensive wounds, the kind someone gets when they're trying to protect themselves from an attack. The location and angle suggested Elena had been grabbed or struck repeatedly on her left side. Admiral Harrison's silence was more unsettling than if he had shouted. Elena could see him processing the information, his military mind cataloging details and drawing conclusions. She knew he was wondering who had done this to her and why she hadn't reported it. "Elena," Sarah said gently, "I need to document these injuries properly. And we need to discuss how this happened." Elena pulled her shirt back down, covering the evidence of her trauma. "It's complicated," she said, still not looking at either of them directly. Admiral Harrison finally spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "Dr. Martinez, these appear to be assault injuries. This is a serious matter that requires immediate attention." Elena shook her head quickly. "No, Admiral. It's not that simple. I can't report this." The fear in her voice was unmistakable. Harrison had heard that same tone from other victims of violence, the fear that speaking up would somehow make things worse. His heart went out to her, but his duty as a commanding officer demanded that he get to the bottom of this situation. "Elena," Sarah said, sitting down beside her friend, "whatever happened, you don't have to face this alone anymore. We're here to help." Elena finally looked up, tears forming in her eyes. The strong, composed medical officer was gone, replaced by a frightened woman who had been carrying a terrible burden. "You don't understand. If I report this, everything I've worked for could be destroyed." Admiral Harrison pulled up a chair, positioning himself at Elena's eye level rather than towering over her. His approach softened, though his concern remained evident. "Help me understand, Doctor. What happened to you?" Elena took a shaky breath. The secret she had been keeping was about to spill out, and she wasn't sure she was ready for the consequences. But the pain was getting worse, and she was beginning to realize she might not have a choice. "It started about 6 weeks ago," she began hesitantly. "I was working late in the medical wing, finishing up patient files. Most of the base was quiet, and I thought I was alone." She paused, gathering courage to continue. Sarah reached out and squeezed her hand encouragingly. "Commander Richards came by. He said he needed to discuss a crew member's medical clearance, but when he entered my office, he closed the door behind him. That should have been my first warning sign." Admiral Harrison's expression darkened at the mention of Commander Richards. He knew the man, a career officer with an spotless record, well regarded by his peers and superiors. The thought that Richards might be capable of assault was difficult to process. He started asking personal questions, Elena continued. "About my social life, whether I was seeing anyone, things that weren't relevant to any medical matters." When I tried to redirect the conversation back to the crew member's case, he became aggressive. Elena's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He said that I had been acting too independent, that as a woman in the military, I needed to remember my place. When I stood up to leave the room, he grabbed my arm and pushed me against the file cabinet." Sarah's grip on Elena's hand tightened. As another woman in the military medical field,
she understood the complex dynamics that Elena had been navigating.
Speaking out against a superior officer, especially one as respected as Commander Richards, could indeed destroy a career. The first time, it was just the grabbing and pushing, Elena said. He left marks on my arms, but they were easy to hide under long sleeves. He told me that if I said anything to anyone, he would make sure I was transferred to the most remote posting the Navy could find. Admiral Harrison listened with growing anger, but he kept his expression neutral. He needed Elena to feel safe enough to tell the complete story, and any display of his rage might cause her to shut down. I thought that was the end of it, Elena continued. But he came back the next week. This time, he was angrier. He accused me of avoiding him and said I was being disrespectful. When I tried to explain that I had simply been busy with my duties, he became violent. Elena's breathing became more labored as she recounted the assault. He shoved me hard against the corner of my desk. The edge caught my ribs, and I heard something crack. When I cried out, he covered my mouth with his hand and told me to be quiet. Sarah was fighting back tears as she listened to her friend's ordeal. She couldn't imagine the fear and isolation Elena must have felt, facing this abuse while trying to maintain her professional duties. He started coming by regularly after that, Elena said. Always when I was alone, always late in the evening. Each time, he would find some excuse to put his hands on me, to remind me that he could hurt me if I didn't comply with his demands. Admiral Harrison's hands were clenched into fists, but his voice remained steady. What kind of demands? Elena's face flushed with humiliation. He wanted me to alter medical records for his crew members. Minor things at first, changing fitness assessments to make marginal candidates appear more qualified. But then, he started asking for bigger favors. She wiped her eyes before continuing. Last week, he wanted me to falsify a psychological evaluation for one of his officers who had failed the mental health screening. When I refused, he became more violent than ever before. Elena pulled up her shirt again, pointing to the fresher wounds. These are from that night. He used his class ring when he hit me, said it would remind me who was in charge. He told me that next time, he wouldn't be so gentle. The room fell silent as Elena finished her account. Admiral Harrison was struggling to contain his fury, while Sarah was processing the implications of what Elena had revealed. The abuse was bad enough, but the corruption of medical records was a serious breach that could endanger lives. Elena, Admiral Harrison said carefully, I understand your fear about reporting this, but you realize we can't let this continue. Elena nodded miserably. I know. But, Admiral, Commander Richards has friends in high places. His uncle is a rear admiral, and his father-in-law serves on the Naval Personnel Board. If I accuse him of assault and corruption, who do you think they'll believe? The political realities of military life were not lost on Harrison. He had seen promising careers destroyed by accusations that couldn't be proven, and he understood Elena's hesitation. But he also knew that allowing Richards to continue his abuse was not an option. There has to be a way to handle this properly, Sarah said. Elena, you're not the first woman this has happened to, and you won't be the last unless we stop him. Elena looked at her friend with a mixture of gratitude and fear. Sarah, if this goes public, my career is over either way. Either I'm branded as a liar who makes false accusations, or I'm seen as a victim who can't handle the pressures of military life. Admiral Harrison stood up and began pacing, his mind working through the complexities of the situation. He had dealt with personnel issues before, but nothing quite like this. The combination of assault, corruption, and political connections made this a particularly challenging case. Dr. Martinez, he said finally, I want you to know that I believe you. And I promise you that we will find a way to handle this that protects both you and the integrity of this command. Elena looked at him with surprise. She had expected skepticism, demands for proof, or suggestions that she might have misinterpreted Commander Richards' actions. Instead, Admiral Harrison was offering his support without question. How can you be so certain? Elena asked. Harrison's expression was grim. Because this isn't the first time I've heard concerns about Commander Richards. Nothing concrete enough to act on before, but there have been whispers. Your account fits a pattern I've been starting to notice.
Elena felt a mix of relief and horror.
Relief that she wasn't alone in her experience, but horror that other women might have suffered similar abuse.
Who else has he hurt? That's what we need to find out, Harrison replied.
But first, we need to get you proper medical treatment and document these injuries officially.
Elena's fear returned immediately.
Admiral, if these injuries go into my official medical record, they'll go into a classified file with access limited to essential personnel, Harrison assured her.
Sarah will handle the documentation personally, and I'll ensure it's properly secured. Sarah nodded in agreement.
Elena, we need photographs and detailed measurements of all your injuries. Not just for potential legal proceedings, but to track your healing and ensure you receive appropriate treatment.
Elena realized that there was no going back now.
The secret was out, and the wheels of military justice would begin turning whether she was ready or not. Part of her felt relief at finally sharing her burden, but another part was terrified of what would come next.
What happens to Commander Richards? Elena asked. Admiral Harrison's jaw tightened again. Leave that to me. But, Elena, I need you to promise me something. What? Promise me you won't be alone with him again.
If he approaches you for any reason, you contact me immediately.
Do you understand?
Elena nodded, though she wondered how she could avoid Richards entirely while still performing her duties. The medical wing was accessible to all base personnel, and Richards could easily find excuses to visit during her shifts. As if reading her thoughts, Sarah spoke up.
I'll make sure Elena isn't alone during her shifts. We can adjust the scheduling so there's always someone else in the medical wing when she's on duty. Admiral Harrison approved of this plan.
Good. And, Dr. Martinez, I want you to take some time off to heal and recover.
That's not a request.
Elena started to protest, but Harrison held up his hand. Your patients need you to be at full strength. Right now, you're not able to give them the care they deserve. She knew he was right. The constant pain and stress had been affecting her performance, though she had been trying to hide it.
Taking time to recover would benefit everyone in the long run. What about the investigation into the water contamination? Elena asked. The crew members who got sick.
Dr. Chen can handle that with support from the base laboratory, Harrison replied.
Your initial findings have already pointed us in the right direction. As they discussed the practical arrangements for Elena's recovery and protection, a new concern arose.
If Commander Richards realized that Elena had reported his abuse, he might become more dangerous or try to retaliate in other ways.
Admiral Harrison was already thinking about this possibility.
He would need to handle Richards carefully, gathering evidence and building a case without alerting him to the investigation.
It would require discretion and strategic planning.
Elena, he said as their conversation wound down, I know this is frightening, but you've done the right thing by telling us.
No one should have to endure what you've been through. Elena felt emotionally drained but also lighter than she had in weeks.
The weight of keeping her secret had been enormous, and sharing it with people who believed and supported her was a huge relief. But, as she looked at the concern on Admiral Harrison's face and the determination in Sarah's eyes, Elena realized that her ordeal was far from over.
In fact, it might be just beginning. The next morning brought an unusual quiet to the naval base.
Elena had been given quarters in the visiting officers section for her safety, and Admiral Harrison had spent most of the night planning his approach to the Commander Richards situation.
He knew that one wrong move could destroy Elena's credibility and allow a dangerous man to continue harming others. Sarah arrived early at the medical wing to begin documenting Elena's injuries properly.
She had brought a specialized camera and measurement tools, knowing that any evidence they gathered would need to meet strict legal standards. Elena sat on the examination table, wearing a hospital gown that made her feel more vulnerable than she had in years. I need to photograph everything, Sarah explained gently. I know this is uncomfortable, but we have to create a complete record.
Elena nodded, understanding the necessity even though she hated being reminded of what Richards had done to her.
As Sarah worked, taking careful photographs from multiple angles and measuring each bruise and wound, Elena found herself thinking about the other women Admiral Harrison had mentioned.
Sarah, Elena said quietly, do you think there are others on this base who've been hurt by Richards?
Sarah paused in her documentation. I don't know for certain, but there have been some signs.
Remember Lieutenant Thompson who requested a transfer last month?
She seemed nervous whenever she had to interact with certain senior officers.
Elena remembered the young woman.
She had seemed eager to leave the base, citing family reasons, but Elena now wondered if there had been more to the story. And, Petty Officer Williams, Sarah continued, she's been having panic attacks whenever she has to deliver reports to the command section. I've been treating her for anxiety, but she won't talk about what triggers it.
The pattern was becoming clearer, and Elena felt sick thinking about how many women might have suffered in silence.
She had been so focused on her own survival that she hadn't noticed the signs in others.
Meanwhile, Admiral Harrison was in his office, carefully reviewing Commander Richards' personnel file.
On paper, Richards appeared to be an exemplary officer.
Commendations for leadership, high marks from superiors, glowing recommendations from previous assignments.
But Harrison was now looking for what wasn't in the file: patterns of behavior, transfers that might have been requested rather than earned promotions. He made a series of discreet phone calls to colleagues at Richards' previous assignments.
The conversations were casual, framed as routine reference checks for a promotion consideration.
What he learned troubled him deeply. At Richards' previous base, there had been an unusual number of requests for transfers among female personnel. One woman had filed a complaint about harassment but later withdrew it under mysterious circumstances. Another had been given a psychological fitness evaluation that suggested she was unable to handle the stresses of military service. The more Harrison dug, the clearer the pattern became. Richards was a predator who had been allowed to move from assignment to assignment, leaving victims in his wake. The military's tendency to handle problems quietly and avoid scandal had enabled his behavior to continue unchecked. Harrison's anger grew with each revelation, but he forced himself to remain methodical.
He needed solid evidence that would stand up to scrutiny, especially given Richards' family connections in the Navy hierarchy. Back in the medical wing, Elena was meeting with the base psychiatrist, Dr. Michael Foster.
Harrison had insisted on a complete evaluation to document the psychological impact of the abuse. Dr. Foster was known for his discretion and professionalism, and Elena felt somewhat comfortable talking with him. Dr. Martinez, Dr. Foster said as he reviewed his notes, what you've described fits the classic pattern of workplace abuse and intimidation. The isolation you've experienced, the fear of reporting, the physical symptoms, these are all normal responses to an abnormal situation. Elena found some comfort in having her experiences validated by a professional. For weeks, she had wondered if she was overreacting or somehow bringing the abuse on herself. The important thing to understand, Dr. Foster continued, is that none of this is your fault. Predators like Commander Richards specifically target competent, successful people because they know their victims will be reluctant to risk their careers by speaking out.
Elena nodded, though she was still struggling with feelings of guilt and shame.
I keep thinking that I should have reported this sooner, that I could have prevented him from hurting others. That kind of thinking is counterproductive, Dr. Foster said kindly. You were protecting yourself the best way you knew how. Now you're taking steps to prevent further harm. That takes enormous courage. As they talked, Elena began to understand the broader implications of her situation. This wasn't just about her own abuse, it was about protecting every woman on the base from a dangerous individual who had been enabled by a system that prioritized reputation over safety.
That afternoon, Admiral Harrison called Elena to his office.
She arrived to find him with a stack of files and a grim expression. He had been busy gathering information, and what he had discovered was worse than either of them had initially realized. Elena, he began, I've been investigating Richard's background, and I believe you may not be his only victim on this base or at his previous assignments. Elena felt her heart sink. Part of her had hoped that her experience was isolated, that Richards had simply lost control with her specifically. Learning that others had suffered made her feel both less alone and more responsible. I need to ask you some difficult questions, Harrison continued.
Did Richards ever mention other women? Did he make any comments about previous encounters or relationships?
Elena thought carefully. He did say something once about teaching other difficult women to respect authority.
At the time, I thought he was just trying to intimidate me, but now it sounds like he was describing a pattern of behavior," Harrison finished. "Elena, I believe we can build a strong case against Richards, but it's going to require courage from his victims to come forward." Elena understood what he was asking. "You want me to help convince other women to report their experiences?"
"Only if you're willing and able," Harrison said.
"I won't pressure you into anything that might compromise your recovery or safety." Elena considered the request.
The thought of reliving her trauma by discussing it with other victims was painful, but the possibility of stopping Richards from hurting anyone else was compelling. "If there are other women who've been hurt, they need to know they're not alone," Elena said finally.
"I'll help if I can." Harrison nodded approvingly.
"I've identified 3 women who may have had negative encounters with Richards. Sarah has agreed to help approach them, given that they might feel more comfortable talking to another woman about sensitive matters." The plan they developed was careful and methodical. Sarah would reach out to the women under the guise of routine mental health check-ins, creating opportunities for them to share their experiences if they chose to. Elena would be available to provide support and share her own story if it would help others feel safe enough to speak up. The first woman they approached was Lieutenant Jennifer Thompson, who had requested the sudden transfer. Sarah found her in the communications center during a quiet shift and asked if they could speak privately about her recent stress levels.
"I've been doing some follow-up on personnel who've requested transfers," Sarah explained.
"Just to make sure everyone is adjusting well and doesn't need additional support."
Jennifer immediately became tense. "I'm fine. The transfer was for family reasons, like I said in my paperwork."
Sarah recognized the defensive response of someone hiding something painful.
"Jennifer, I want you to know that anything you share with me is confidential.
If there were other reasons for your transfer request, no one will judge you for it."
Jennifer looked around nervously, then made a decision. "Can we go somewhere more private?"
They moved to a small conference room, and Jennifer's composure began to crack.
"It wasn't really about my family," she admitted. "I couldn't stay here anymore after what happened." Sarah waited patiently as Jennifer gathered courage to continue.
"Commander Richards cornered me in the supply room about 2 months ago," Jennifer said. "He claimed he needed to discuss my performance, but then he started asking personal questions and making inappropriate comments about my appearance." Sarah felt a familiar anger building but kept her voice gentle.
"What happened then?"
"When I tried to leave, he blocked the door. He said that young female officers needed to learn proper respect for their superiors. Then, he pushed me against the wall and put his hands on me." Jennifer was crying now, reliving the trauma she had tried to bury. "I was so scared and confused. He was my superior officer, and I didn't know what to do. When I finally got away, he warned me that reporting the incident would be bad for my career." Sarah reached out and squeezed Jennifer's hand.
"Jennifer, you're not alone.
Other women have had similar experiences with Commander Richards."
Jennifer looked up in shock. "Other women? How many?"
"That's what we're trying to determine," Sarah replied.
"Would you be willing to speak with someone else who's been through this? It might help both of you to know you're not isolated." Jennifer nodded hesitantly.
"If it would help stop him from hurting anyone else, yes." The meeting between Elena and Jennifer was emotional but healing for both women. Elena shared her story first, giving Jennifer permission to open up about her own trauma. They discovered that Richards had used almost identical tactics with both of them: the isolation, the intimidation, the threats about career consequences.
"I thought I was weak for not fighting back harder," Jennifer admitted.
"You survived," Elena replied.
"That's not weakness, that's strength.
And now we have the chance to make sure he can't do this to anyone else." The second woman, Petty Officer Williams, was more difficult to approach. She had developed severe anxiety around authority figures and initially refused to discuss anything beyond her official duties. It took several gentle conversations before Sarah was able to create enough trust for Williams to share her experience.
Williams' encounter with Richards had been particularly traumatic.
He had cornered her during a night shift when the base was nearly empty, and the assault had been more severe than what Elena and Jennifer had experienced. Williams had been too terrified to report it and had requested psychological counseling for what she described as general anxiety. "I started having nightmares," Williams told Elena during their private meeting. "Every time I see him on base, I have panic attacks. I've been taking medication just to function at work." Elena felt overwhelming sympathy for the young woman. Williams was barely 22 years old, new to military life, and completely unprepared to deal with a predator like Richards. "You don't have to face this alone anymore," Elena assured her. "We're going to make sure he's held accountable for what he's done." As the women shared their stories, a clear pattern emerged. Richards had been systematically targeting female personnel, using his authority and knowledge of military culture to silence his victims. He chose women who were isolated, ambitious, or vulnerable in some way, knowing they would be reluctant to risk their careers by reporting him. Admiral Harrison was building a comprehensive case file that documented Richards' pattern of abuse across multiple assignments. He had also quietly begun investigating Richards' current behavior, having him followed discreetly and monitoring his interactions with female personnel. The evidence was compelling, but Harrison knew that prosecuting a well-connected officer would require overwhelming proof. Military justice could be influenced by politics and personal relationships, especially when it involved serious accusations against someone with family ties to senior leadership. Elena's courage in coming forward had started a chain reaction that was exposing years of covered-up abuse. Each woman who spoke up made it harder for Richard's supporters to dismiss the allegations as isolated incidents or false accusations. But, as word began to spread through certain channels that Richards was under investigation, Elena started receiving threatening messages. Someone was warning her to drop her accusations and leave the base quietly, or face consequences that would destroy her career permanently. The messages were unsigned and untraceable, but their intent was clear. Richards had powerful friends who were willing to intimidate his victims to protect him. Elena realized that speaking out had put not just her career at risk, but potentially her safety as well. Admiral Harrison increased security measures around Elena and the other women, but he knew that the real solution was to move quickly with the formal charges. The longer the investigation dragged on, the more time Richard's supporters would have to organize a defense or discredit the victims. The case was about to move beyond the base level to higher naval authorities, and Elena knew that her courage would be tested in ways she had never imagined. The quiet disclosure of her injuries had set in motion events that would challenge the entire culture of how the military handled abuse and accountability. As she prepared for what would likely be the most difficult period of her life, Elena found strength in knowing that her suffering might prevent other women from experiencing the same trauma. The price of justice was proving to be higher than she had anticipated, but the cost of silence would have been infinitely worse. 3 weeks after Elena's revelation, the naval base felt like a powder keg ready to explode. Word had leaked that a senior officer was under investigation for serious misconduct, and tensions were running high throughout the command structure. Elena found herself at the center of a storm that threatened to tear apart everything she had worked to build in her military career. The formal investigation had been launched by the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and Elena had spent hours being interviewed by investigators who documented every detail of Richard's abuse. The process was thorough but emotionally draining, forcing her to relive her trauma repeatedly for different officials and legal representatives. Admiral Harrison had been walking a tightrope, trying to protect Elena and the other victims while managing pressure from higher-ranking officers who were concerned about the potential scandal. Commander Richards' uncle, Rear Admiral Charles Richards, had already made several calls expressing his concerns about the rush to judgment against his nephew. Elena was in her temporary quarters when Sarah arrived with troubling news. "Elena, there's something you need to know. Commander Richards has hired a civilian attorney, and they're planning to challenge the investigation." Elena felt her stomach drop. "On what grounds?" "They're claiming that the investigation is biased and that you have a personal vendetta against Richards. They're also suggesting that your medical condition might be affecting your ability to accurately remember events." The strategy was predictable but effective. By questioning Elena's credibility and mental state, Richard's defense team could cast doubt on all the victims' accounts. Elena knew that this was exactly what she had feared when she first hesitated to report the abuse. "There's more," Sarah continued reluctantly.
They've requested access to your complete medical records, including your psychiatric evaluation with Dr. Foster. Elena felt violated all over again.
The idea that her private medical information would be scrutinized and potentially used against her was almost as traumatic as the original abuse.
Can they do that?
Admiral Harrison is fighting it, but there are legal precedents that might allow it, Sarah explained. The defense has the right to examine evidence that might affect your credibility as a witness.
That evening, Elena met with Admiral Harrison in his office to discuss the latest developments.
She could see the stress in his face. He had been dealing with pressure from multiple directions while trying to ensure that justice was served.
Elena, Harrison began, I want you to know that I believe in you and, in this case. But, I also need you to understand what we're up against.
He spread several documents across his desk.
Richard's family connections run deeper than we initially realized. His uncle isn't just a rear admiral, he's being considered for promotion to vice admiral.
There are people who want this whole situation to disappear quietly. Elena studied the documents, seeing political maneuvering and influence networks that she had never fully understood.
Are you saying they can just make this go away?
Not if we do this right, Harrison replied firmly. But we need more than just testimony from the victims. We need physical evidence, documentation, something that can't be dismissed as personal grievances or false memories.
Elena thought about what additional evidence might exist. What about security camera footage?
Some of the attacks happened in areas that might be monitored.
Harrison had already considered this.
We've recovered some footage, but most of it isn't clear enough to be conclusive.
Richards was careful about where and when he acted.
The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door.
Dr. Foster entered, looking grave. Admiral, Dr. Martinez, I'm afraid I have some concerning news. Elena braced herself for another setback.
I've been contacted by Richard's attorney, Dr. Foster explained. They're demanding that I testify about Elena's mental state and suggest that her trauma responses might be creating false memories. Elena felt betrayed, even though she knew Dr. Foster was being compelled to cooperate.
You would testify against me? Not against you, Dr. Foster clarified.
I would testify honestly about trauma responses and memory formation. But, Elena, you should know that trauma can sometimes affect how we remember details of events.
Elena understood that Dr. Foster was trying to prepare her for how his testimony might be used, but it still felt like losing a crucial ally. If even the psychiatrist who had validated her experiences could be turned into a weapon against her, what chance did she have?
The next morning brought a development that changed everything. Lieutenant Thompson approached Elena with information she had been afraid to share previously. Elena, Jennifer said nervously, there's something else about my encounter with Commander Richards.
Something I didn't tell Sarah when we first talked. Elena waited patiently as Jennifer gathered courage to continue.
After he assaulted me, Richards thought he heard someone coming and got careless. He left something behind in the supply room, his class ring. I picked it up without thinking, and I've kept it all this time.
Elena's heart raced.
Jennifer, that ring could be crucial evidence. If it has your DNA on it from the struggle, and his fingerprints.
I know, Jennifer said.
I was too scared to turn it in before, but seeing what you've gone through to seek justice has given me courage. They immediately took the ring to Admiral Harrison, who recognized its potential importance. The ring could provide physical evidence linking Richards to the assault, something much more difficult to dismiss than testimony alone. While they were discussing how to properly handle this new evidence, Sarah burst into the office with urgent news.
Admiral, we have a problem.
Commander Richards has just filed a counter-complaint alleging that Elena has been conducting a harassment campaign against him. Elena felt the world spinning around her.
What kind of harassment campaign? Sarah consulted her notes.
He claims you've been spreading false rumors about him, attempting to damage his reputation, and coordinating with other female personnel to fabricate complaints.
He's requesting a full investigation into your conduct. Admiral Harrison's jaw tightened. It's a classic deflection strategy.
When you can't defend against the charges, you go on the attack and try to make the victim look like the aggressor. Elena realized that Richards was fighting back with everything he had, and his resources were considerable. The counter-complaint would muddy the waters and potentially delay the investigation while officials sorted through competing allegations. "Admiral," Elena said quietly, "maybe I should just withdraw my complaint. This is getting too complicated, and too many people are getting hurt." Harrison looked at her with a mixture of understanding and disappointment. "Elena, I understand why you'd want this to end. But if you walk away now, Richards will have one. He'll continue hurting other women, and he'll know that he can intimidate victims into silence." Elena knew he was right, but the pressure was becoming overwhelming. Every day brought new legal maneuvers, political pressure, and personal attacks. She was beginning to wonder if seeking justice was worth the cost. That evening, Elena received an unexpected visitor. Petty Officer Williams knocked on her door, looking nervous but determined. "Dr. Martinez," Williams said, "I wanted to thank you for giving me the courage to speak up. But there's something else you should know." Elena invited her in, wondering what other revelations were coming. "I've been doing some research on Commander Richards," Williams continued. "I contacted women at his previous assignments, and I found 2 others who are willing to come forward with their stories." Elena felt a surge of hope. Additional victims from other bases would make it much harder for Richard's supporters to claim that the allegations were part of a local conspiracy. "There's more," Williams said. One of the women kept documentation of her encounter, photographs of her injuries, and a detailed journal of what happened. She was too afraid to report it at the time, but she's willing to share the evidence now. This could be the breakthrough they needed. Independent documentation from a different base would establish a clear pattern of behavior and provide corroborating evidence for Elena's account. Admiral Harrison immediately began coordinating with officials at Richard's previous assignments to properly collect and document this new evidence. The investigation was expanding beyond what anyone had initially expected, revealing a pattern of abuse that spanned years and multiple duty stations. As word of the expanding investigation spread, Elena began receiving messages of support from unexpected sources. Female personnel throughout the Navy who had heard about the case were sharing their own stories, creating a network of survivors who had found courage in Elena's example. But the support came with increased danger. Elena started receiving more serious threats, including warnings that pursuing the case would result in permanent consequences for her safety. Admiral Harrison arranged for security escorts and changed Elena's living arrangements again. The turning point came when investigators discovered that Richards had been using his position to access personnel files of female officers, gathering information that he could use to identify vulnerable targets and potential pressure points. This abuse of his administrative authority provided additional charges beyond the assault allegations. The evidence was becoming overwhelming, but the political pressure was intensifying as well. Elena learned that Richard's supporters were preparing to argue that the entire investigation was part of a broader attack on traditional military values and male leadership. During one particularly difficult day of testimony, Elena found herself questioned by a panel of officers who seemed more interested in discrediting her than in finding the truth. They asked invasive questions about her personal life, her relationships with colleagues, and her motivations for joining the military. "Dr. Martinez," one officer asked with barely concealed hostility, "isn't it true that you've always had difficulty accepting authority from male superiors?" Elena felt her anger rising but kept her voice steady. "Sir, I've never had difficulty accepting legitimate authority. What I have difficulty accepting is abuse disguised as authority." The questioning continued for hours, with panel members attempting to find inconsistencies in her story or evidence of bias against Richards. Elena answered every question as honestly as she could, knowing that her credibility was under intense scrutiny. When the session finally ended, Elena felt emotionally drained but also stronger. She had faced the worst they could throw at her and had maintained her composure and honesty throughout. Admiral Harrison was waiting for her outside the hearing room. "How are you holding up?" "I'm tired," Elena admitted, "but I'm not backing down. Too many people are counting on this case to succeed." Harrison nodded approvingly. "The final decision should come soon. All the evidence has been presented, and the investigating panel has everything they need to make their determination." Elena knew that the waiting would be the hardest part. After months of fighting, the resolution was finally approaching, but she had no way of knowing whether justice would prevail or whether Richard's connections would protect him from consequences. 3 days later, Admiral Harrison called Elena to his office with the results. She entered to find him standing behind his desk with an expression she couldn't read. "Elena," he began, "the investigation panel has reached their decision." Elena held her breath, preparing herself for either vindication or devastating disappointment. "Commander Richards has been found guilty of assault, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. He's being court-martialed and will face dismissal from the Navy." Elena felt relief wash over her like a wave. After everything she had endured, justice was finally being served. "There's more," Harrison continued. "The panel was so disturbed by the pattern of abuse they uncovered that they're recommending a full review of policies and procedures for handling harassment complaints throughout the Navy." Elena realized that her courage in speaking up had accomplished more than just stopping one predator. It had sparked changes that could protect countless other women in the future. 6 months later, Elena was back to full duty as head medical officer, her reputation not only restored but enhanced by her courage in the face of adversity. Commander Richards had been dismissed from the Navy and was facing civilian criminal charges for his actions. The threats and intimidation had ended, replaced by respect from colleagues who admired Elena's strength and integrity. She had received commendations for her service and had been asked to help develop new training programs for preventing and responding to harassment. Admiral Harrison continued to serve as Elena's mentor and supporter, their professional relationship deepened by the trials they had faced together. He often referred to Elena's case when discussing the importance of protecting personnel and maintaining the highest standards of conduct. Elena's injuries had healed completely, leaving only faint scars that served as reminders of how far she had come. She continued working as a military physician, but now she also served as an advocate for other victims of abuse, helping them find the courage to speak up and seek justice. The young women who had suffered alongside Elena, Jennifer Thompson, Petty Officer Williams, and others had found their own paths to healing and success. They remained connected, supporting each other through ongoing recovery and celebrating their collective victory over a system that had initially failed to protect them. Elena often reflected on that day when she had been forced to expose her wounds to Admiral Harrison and Sarah. What had seemed like the worst moment of her life had actually been the beginning of her journey toward justice and healing. Her courage in that moment of vulnerability had not only saved herself but had protected countless other women from suffering the same abuse. The scars from her ribs had faded, but the strength she had discovered within herself remained. Elena had learned that true courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the willingness to do what's right despite the fear. Her journey from victim to survivor to advocate had shown her that speaking the truth, no matter how difficult, was always worth the cost. As she continued her service in the Navy, Elena carried with her the knowledge that she had made a difference. Her willingness to expose her wounds, both physical and emotional, had helped create a safer environment for all women in uniform. And, for Elena, that legacy was worth every moment of pain she had endured to achieve it.